Good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to welcome and thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Montgomery. I'm one of the family education coordinators for Swindells, located at the Province Child Center. And for the first time today, we will be live streaming this event. So we are excited about this, and we appreciate your guys' patience through this process as well. Please be conscious of the speaker's time, and please silence any cell phone or a pager if you have one. In your hand, you will find an evaluation. On the front side is for families or caregivers. On the back side is for strictly for professionals. So please fill out the side that pertains to you and your needs. At the end of the presentation, we would greatly appreciate that feedback for future presentations that we provide throughout the state. Swindells is 100% philanthropy funded through the hard work of our donors at the Province Child Center. They are able to bring us great speakers like Tabacco today. You may be aware that 29% of children with special health care needs in Oregon have conditions that consistently affect their daily activities, which include their education and learning. Today we are partnering with Park, which is Oregon Post-Adoption Resource Center. They support families throughout the state of Oregon who have been adopted through the state or foster care system. As well, we continue to partner with Family to Family to provide these speaking events throughout the state of Oregon. Park will be here as one of the resource vendors today, starting at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock today. Aaron is an RN with a BSN as well as a PhD candidate in neurodevelopment as a neurodevelopment specialist who researches in family development, School of Nursing, as well as an assistant professor of nursing at Linfield College. Aaron is driven in part by his personal experiences as a father of 3 sons who live with ADHD. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Aaron Tabacco.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, and good morning to all of you. I do a lot of speaking and across the Northwest and at times country and abroad, and I think this is the first time I've had such a big production in terms of live streaming and video capture and multiple language interpretation going on, so I feel a little like a celebrity today. Not a bad gig, right? Good, nice work if you can get it, as the song goes. I'm really delighted to be here with you. I have partnered with Swindells a number of times over the years. I think that this is one of my favorite organizations to be able to work with. I always try to save a little room in my calendar each year for Jody and the team, so very happy to be here with you all today. I was asked to speak in my topical area of expertise, which really is ADHD and the family. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about things perhaps from a perspective that you don't often hear, as we are always so focused on our children specifically. And there certainly will be lots of good information about your children specifically that you can take with you. But also, I think it's important to look more broadly at the whole family and the health of the whole family. And my experience as a researcher has certainly taught me that that is true. Little more about me, and thanks, Stephanie, for the nice intro. So we've got some information here for you. My discipline is nursing. I am a registered nurse. In neurodevelopmental pediatrics is my specialty. I have been in nursing for 14 years or something like that now. And a great majority of that time I have been attached to the Child Development and Rehabilitation Center up at OHSU as a faculty in residence there, and the OHSU School of Nursing, where I've been a researcher for 10 years. And most recently I have moved my teaching practice to Linfield College, where I work as a visiting assistant professor. And I do stay in contact with the clinical world by working independently, doing care coordination for families who have children with ADHD, just like you. A very small part of what I do, but it allows me to continue to stay connected to practice. So in terms of my scholarly work, I've contributed as an editor and author to some, I think, pretty significant textbooks in the world of nursing. So if you were all nurses, you'd be super impressed right now. But one in particular is a specialty pediatric book, and the other is a specialty book on families, taking care of families as nurses. So family science is certainly a big part of my background. In terms of primary research, I've collaborated with and published here in the US, in Japan, and in Europe. And so I've been able to be very fortunate in my career to meet families with kids with a lot of special needs across the globe and collaborate with my colleagues. It's been a pretty wonderful career. I actually think that all of that sort of impressive stuff aside, it sounds better on paper. When I read this, I'm like, who is this guy? When did that happen? I think the thing that parents are most interested in is that I am a father of 3 sons who live with ADHD, and they're each a little different in their presentation, which is probably something you're familiar with. They are now 20, nearly 20 rather, and 17 and 14. So if we were a big support group today, I'm surviving, right? We're making it through, living proof of that. In fact, here's a little picture of time going by here. I do call them my cheeky monkeys. They are very cheeky indeed. Actually, I think there were fights that broke out before both of these photos. But somehow we got it to work. I don't know. I find it's very important when I meet with folks like you, who are just like folks like me, that I share my perspectives as a person who lives and works in this world of healthcare, my own beliefs and biases. I practice from what is growingly known as a neurodiversity model, as a clinician, as a researcher, which means that I see all of these differences within our children as part of the human story, as challenges, but also as gifts, and not necessarily as things to be cured, but rather supported. That's a really important thing I think I would like you to know about, just where I'm coming from and how I look at scientific literature and clinical practice and everyday family life. Disability is, as many of you know, is can be a very useful framework for gaining access to resources and understanding and communicating about our children. But I also understand that, how disability is defined is very cultural in its nature. And I am really open to and have been embracing a neurodiversity model for a number of years. I find that to be really useful. At the same time, these diversities are very challenging. They're very real. And I hear you and I see you and I know that. I live and experience that myself. So I think that the neurodiversity model actually opens up a pathway for us to figure out the best way to help us support our children and the rest of our family members and the rest of the community as well, in terms of how we go forward with something like ADHD. And also throw out there that I firmly believe, and this is probably rooted in my practice in nursing, my own disciplines, beliefs, and values, there really is no one right way to approach ADHD, that every family has to kind of customize based on their own beliefs and values and understandings. My only ask when I work with families is to set aside biases, understand them, and just be open to discussing all of the possibilities, because we do best serving families and children when we are actually open to all of those things, and we can bring the best evidence we have to the table, and sometimes that evidence is the evidence that comes from your home. So it's not always what's in the scientific literature, but that's a useful piece as well. So those are just those things. I like to put those out there so you know where I'm coming from, what my biases are. I certainly can say, and I know I've already kind of hinted at this, that ADHD is a family experience, right? And I think that's true. I think when you consider anything that has chronicity with health or behavior or learning, that it really is a family experience. And therefore, as a clinician, as a father, and as a researcher, I've learned that we need to approach ADHD from that perspective, which is why I wanted to bring these pieces forward and kind of give you that viewpoint. Let me see. Let's move into what we've learned about ADHD in families, because that can be researched, and that's what I've been doing for these last several years. So we're going to give you a little tour here of the better part of a decade in terms of research. I'm going to stay hydrated as well. I have to tell you, I'm making some sacrifices today. They said we're streaming this, we're videoing it. You need to stand on this 4-foot by 3-foot platform. Don't go out of the view, and watch all your voice levels. And I like to get out there with you all, so I'm doing my best here, folks. Dr. Judy Kendall is not even arguably, probably the foremost researcher in ADHD and the family for a very long time. She really was the first person to consider ADHD from that family perspective and apply empirical research methods to studying the family. So very early research in that in the middle 90s began. She wanted to understand what is the process of family experiences over time when they live with a child with ADHD. And so she did a very in-depth, what we call qualitative study. Lots of interviews, one-to-one interviews with many, many different family members. There were 15 families total involved, and while that number seems kind of small, that was 59 persons, and those 59 persons each spent an hour to 2 hours or more over time with Judy, all of that being audio recorded, turned into transcripts. This becomes mountains of data, mountains and mountains of data. And her goal was to figure out this process and try to understand it and share that with the rest of the world. And what emerged from that was this grand theme that what families experience and how they live through this process is called outlasting disruption. How many of you were viewers of Survivor? A few of you, right? You're like, I know what you're talking about. It was something like outwit, outlast, out something. And that kind of was the primary theme here, was that this was a process of outlasting, and specifically the disruptions of ADHD to family life. There were 7 types of disruptions families learned to outlast. And just take a look at the list, and you can just silently nod your head if that sounds familiar to you. I imagine it probably does. None of those are small things. These are pretty significant challenges for individuals and families. And it's not surprising that while those were the sort of 7 core disruptions families focused upon, that this last point there being is very important. That the acuity or the difficulty level with those problems really depended on the child's age and their developmental stage. So this idea that we have kind of a waxing and waning of the experience of ADHD within the family probably also resonates with you. That sometimes things are chaos, and then you figure some things out again, and it kind of smooths out for a while until something changes. They grow a little older, change to a different grade, a new sibling is born, whatever happens, and then that disruption begins again. So it's quite a process. Now, while it was outlasting disruption was the overall theme, the process itself was this process of reinvestment over time. So let me kind of explain what that means. There were pieces of how families experienced this that fell within these categories And in this, so I don't even want to say sequence, but in this process-oriented world of ADHD that began with making sense of the child and the situation. There were a few different parts of that. Things had to kind of sink in, had to kind of come to a sense of believing or accepting of that. Then there was engagement. Okay, I understand things better. I've got a new tool. I'm going to apply it. We're going to work through the chaos and the disruption. Things will get better. And then we'll kind of ease into it again for a while. And then the disruptions will happen again. And we'll jump back into, okay, sinking in and believing, okay, something's different. We've got to make an adjustment. You go into this cycle that goes over and over and over again. And it's a process of wearing out physically and emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. It's a pretty comprehensive process of going in, engaging, working hard over and over and over time, which leads to this wearing out cycle. And eventually, in terms of making sense, a transfer of the responsibility. At some point in child's development, right, we let go and say, what will be, and this is the child. This is my child. This is who they are. So I'm not going to own all of that and take all of that on my shoulders anymore in the same way. Another big piece of this is this interesting idea called recasting biography. When families or individuals within families are recasting their biographies, it's a multi-generational experience. Children with ADHD tend to spark parents to think about their own childhoods and how they experienced them and what those childhoods meant. And especially true in families where one of the parents, one or both of the parents, also lives with ADHD. There was a looking back, looking forward, and a recasting of the biography of their own life to understand themselves a little bit better. Applying that to themselves and their child was a process of grieving a little bit. I would like things to be better for my child than they were for me. That would be really desirable, but I see the same patterns happening over and over. Learning to separate the self from the child. Like, okay, well, that was my journey. This is their journey. I got to figure that piece out a little bit. I learned this lesson recently from a really good friend of mine. So as a dad, so I can put my dad hat on for a moment, with my youngest, who is probably the most challenging of my three. How lucky is that? You know, you're just getting ready to kind of launch them all. And it's the last one that really is making my hair go straight to white, skipping gray entirely. And I was talking with a really good friend about this, and he offered the thought that, well, had you considered that you're being the father to him that you wanted as a child? And is that maybe different than the father he needs? And I thought, wow, yeah, I think that's true. I think I do that. It really made me recast my biography and think, hold on, I need to kind of individuate this a little bit. I need to stop projecting my needs and my experiences and my hopes and my fears and my history onto him and customize by seeing him for who he is and offering him the father he actually needs, which is sort of different than the way I'd been doing it. So even after 20 years of fathering, I'm still learning, so we're all in good company. I stand up here and I think, why do people listen to me? You know, like who am I to tell you all of this stuff? And I realize that, when you go out and you listen to a speaker and they're talking with you and they have a title and they have an education and they seem to present themselves as someone who knows it all, that, I am just as likely to go back and then get frustrated and shout at my son, haven't I told you 2,000 times not to do this to your brother? And find myself doing exactly the same things we all do. So I tell on myself a lot. I keep myself accountable to. But this really is that process of recasting biography. It's really looking deeply at yourself and your child, coming to a sense of pulling apart those identities so that the child's identity is theirs and your identity is yours. And you begin this process of kind of healing through all of that deep enmeshment we have because, our kids do need us so much. And they take so much effort, and we become so engaged in their lives. Third part of the process of reinvesting, and again, we'll get to that a little more deeply in just a moment, has this concept of the good ending and relinquishing that. And I think what that really means is that this last piece of that, letting go of the anticipated child, is that process of truly letting go. Of, when this child is born, I tell this to my students of nursing in my role there when we're talking about lifespan, and we get to those fun areas where we talk about childbearing families, and we talk about, you're going to go out into clinical at some point while you're here with us, and you're going to participate in birth and see, little babies coming into the world in their first moments. And, I want you to stop for just a moment and think, when you see that brand new life right there, just hold that baby if you get a chance and really look deep and say to yourself, 85 years, right? Like 85 years is represented here, give or take. Hopefully, health will be great and it'll be a long and fruitful lifespan. But you look at this brand new infant, and just to contextualize for my nursing students, really take that in for a moment. That 85 years and all that will happen is exactly what the family you're taking care of is feeling and seeing and thinking. They see immediately scraped knees and learning to ride a bicycle and going to school and making friends and having birthday parties and prom and all of these things that society does and our children will participate in, we hope. And we hope the best for them. But whether we realize it or not, we do paint a pretty specific picture of what that will look like. And family sciences teaches us that as parents, it's sort of a normal part of the process of parenting that at some point, usually in middle adolescence, when children are really asserting their individuality and we get tired of that and we basically embrace it and say, that's just who they are. We kind of get there eventually. And this process of recasting biography and relinquishing the ending we anticipated seeing is sort of healthy, and we all kind of get to that place. It's a little bit more challenging to do that when your child doesn't seem to be progressing in a way you think will match that picture. That's where a lot of that conflict comes from. And the interesting thing that I have learned about that as a scholar and a clinician is that the healthy way to help families do really well with ADHD is to help them embrace that relinquishing their anticipated child really early on. How many of you have read or heard Welcome to Holland? Sort of a very, I see some hands. It's sort of a very famous little tiny brief essay written by a mother of a child with special health care needs. Who talks about, this pregnancy and all this planning and like it being planning a trip to Italy. And you buy all the guidebooks and you learn about Italy and you study history and you practice language and you go out to eat at Italian restaurants and get yourself all ready for this experience to go to Italy. And you board the plane and you're like, wow, this is fantastic. In 12 hours, I'll be in Italy. And then you land and the flight attendant or the captain says, welcome to Holland. And you're like, well, wait a minute. What? I planned a trip to Italy. And they're like, yeah, okay, well, you're in Holland. So what is that going to mean to you? There's a process initially of, wait a minute, confusion and maybe disappointment and fear. I don't know anything about Holland. I didn't study Holland. I studied Italy. But there's also some choices there for us to either be frustrated and angry and grieve for an extended period about not being in Italy, or to walk out the door and realize Holland is amazing. It's beautiful. It's canals and amazing buildings and fantastic pancakes. If you ever want a tip, I have got a great place for you. Right? It's a fantastic experience, but we don't experience it that way until we get to that place of opening that door and saying, I am in Holland. I'm going to welcome myself here to that. So this process that Judy talked about, Dr. Kendall, of going through this over many years, this process of investing in the child and putting all these pieces into place for intervention and finding what works and having it work, and then burning out because it doesn't work, and you repeated that cycle 10 times, and learning to kind of separate the self from the child again. And you've got, all of a sudden, when you do that, you've got this new energy again. Like, well, all that energy I was putting into trying to fix or cure or manage or whatever words you're using with your child, that's a lot of energy. So where does it go? And for most families, the process after that point of awakening was the process of reinvesting, taking that energy and putting it back into their lives and families in a really healthy way. And that just basically means, once again, falling in love with the child you have, rather than grieving the loss of that anticipated child that is Holland, right? Where do they put those energies? Doesn't that look great? If you had all that, think about all the energy you spend on managing ADHD and homework, for example. He's like, how do you know that, Aaron? Like, well, not only am I a dad, but research tells us, right, that is the number one stressor for school-aged children with ADHD and families is homework. So if you took all those hours that you put into homework and stressing about it and thinking about it and worrying about it and being up till midnight with the 3-panel science board because, there's a science fair tomorrow morning, right, that you just learned about. If you could invest that in these areas, how much happier and healthier would you be in the family? So definitely a journey. Definitely a journey. And I'm not by any means saying, just go out and make that and just change your investment strategy, right? Because that takes a lot of time, and we can't let all of these balls drop when we're taking care of these kiddos. But it is very interesting that this is what we learned from families raising children with ADHD over time. That's the process, a process of becoming reinvested. Now, along with that, time to hydrate. Along with that, we did some secondary analysis of this data. So we had all of these fantastic interviews, and we asked the question, well, what about the family's management style? Because something else that had kind of erupted in healthcare research around this time, the late 90s, was some fantastic work done by a colleague of mine, Kathy Knaffel, who looked at the family management styles of families who had a child with a chronic illness of some kind. Diabetes, for example, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, those kinds of pieces. They were pieces that required ongoing management over time, sometimes with acute care situations, but most of the time sort of everyday life. And in Kathy's work, she discovered that families actually had distinct management styles, and there were 5 of them. And in the language of the time, the styles were known across a spectrum of from what was called floundering, families who just didn't have any kind of management strategies in place and were really chaotically disrupted, all the way to thriving. So that was kind of the 2 ends of the spectrum of these 5 styles. And so Judy said, well, I wonder if that knowledge actually applies in families with children with ADHD. And she, as a scientist, said, I don't know that it will, because the conditions that are looked at here really don't have, one, they don't have invisibility, where ADHD has a certain element of invisibility to it. We don't see insulin shots. We don't see blood glucose readings, for example, right? So those pieces of ADHD that are physical, et cetera, those pieces become invisible. And so that was something that she said, I think probably will be a bit different. And also in Kathy's work, she didn't look at learning disabilities, learning differences. She didn't look at behavioral challenges or any sort of major mental health issues on any part of the extreme, whether it was from sort of basic, I would say basic, but mood disorders like depression, but then going to farther down the spectrum like a bipolar disorder or other types of things that are really acute and have a lot of management needs. So given that those pieces weren't part of Kathy's work, Judy said, well, let's go. Let's see what we can find. So she dug back into her data with all of those 15 families. And actually, there were not 5 styles. There were 4 distinct styles. They still kind of went from one sort of spectrum to another. But they began with this chaotic style, again, was actually the terminology that seemed best based on the data, through something called ADHD controlled, which we'll get into, surviving, there's our outlasting disruption part, and then, lo and behold, the reinvested family style, which was also apparent because that's the process that she learned about from families. So it really kind of fit together very, very nicely. And as you can imagine, you just taking a look at the list here, chaotic sounds sort of self-explanatory. I want to point out that only one family in the whole study actually displayed a chaotic management style. It is not, while our own lives may feel chaotic, it had a very specific meaning. And basically, the underlying piece that defined it was an emotional divestment amongst all family members. They cohabitated, that was kind of it. Right? They really weren't terribly interested in all of the disruptions, fixing anything, helping anything, supporting anything. They just basically coexisted and had become sort of island states. Really scary and disappointing. We certainly don't want any family to get to that place. So I do point out, this was very rare to see that in the study. Only one family had that characteristic. More common were these 2 in the middle, the ADHD controlled and the surviving. Now, to be clear, ADHD controlled doesn't mean the ADHD was controlled. The family was controlled by the ADHD, and you can kind of see there's some little descriptors of that, and basically how the child's symptoms and needs really determined all of family life. And I certainly know that I have been in those moments in that style as well from time to time. So moving on, a subtle but really big difference was the family who was in that surviving style. And in that context, what we have is kind of a shift. Now, symptoms, stressors are still very present for families. However, they've started to consciously shift back toward, well, we can't let every family meeting, decision, family reunion, holiday party be directed by those needs. So they're kind of reclaiming some of family life and shifting ADHD away from the control or the center. And I think it also lined up really nicely. If you look at the 3rd item down under surviving, that perspective of the ADHD, the child self, kind of allied with that recasting biography piece, that awakening that was happening, that, wait a minute, I am in Holland, and I think there's some good things here. Maybe the things I don't like, I can kind of start to ignore those a little bit. Like walking through Amsterdam at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. You may find some things that aren't really your cup of tea, right? But you can kind of learn to just move beyond that and enjoy the rest of Holland or Amsterdam, on all of those days of the weeks. That is fantastic. But you don't have to let it control you. So kind of an important distinction. An awakening that Holland really is where you're at, and there's some neat things about it. And then again, fewer families, but I think probably had to do with where they were. These families were scattered among different developmental stages and ages, all of them. But those who had reached the reinvested sort of state or family management style, they were fewer, but ADHD really, moved to the back burner. Yes, everyone understood it. They accepted that as part of their child, but it really was not the prime determinant of everyday life anymore. It didn't own them in the same way it had for several years prior. A really big key to getting to this place was the biological, neurological understanding of ADHD. Understanding that this is not a moral deficiency. a willful disregard for learning, authority, structure, etc., but that there was an underlying visibility to ADHD that was explained by the brain. That particular bit of knowledge was critical to getting there. And so, of course, today I'm going to really talk about that because we have a lot of fantastic science about ADHD, and it rarely really makes it meaningfully out to the public. Even actually amongst my colleagues in healthcare, there are very few people who really own this understanding of ADHD and its life in the brain. So we're going to talk about that to give you that, hopefully, that gift of that. And then that, again, that idea of the letting go of that anticipated child, accepting the child for who they actually are. Okay, that's a lot of family science stuff. Hopefully you see yourselves in there somewhere. I know the very first time I actually read this particular research publication by Judy, I was just getting to know her, and she was bringing me on as a doctoral student. And I read that as a dad, and I was like, oh, I so want to believe I'm reinvested. I was not. I have moments where I see that I'm reinvested in that style, and still somewhere, not so much. We have moments of ADHD controlled, right? There's no like one place I think you stay with these things all the time. That these things, of course, like the whole process of ADHD, we talked about kind of this cycle of going in and pulling up your bootstraps and learning new things and applying them and then having it stop working and regrouping and all of those pieces. It's kind of the same with our family management styles. We switch them as we learn. We kind of go back and forth as the child changes over time with hopefully the goal of making it to this reinvested state. More research. You would think that people who are researchers in this world of child and family health care would have all kinds of studies done about siblings. Not so much. We don't have a lot of really good, broad research that has been done about siblings of children with any particular diagnosis. And that was very true of ADHD. At the time Judy did a sibling study, we didn't have any knowledge at all. So, 39 siblings, ages 6 to 17. This was part of a larger study on ADHD, family, and ethnicity. So we had a couple of different study collection sites here in Portland and also with a colleague in Southern California. And these findings were difficult for us to read, to be honest. Siblings really had a chance to tell their stories. And children with ADHD, these are children with ADHD who talked about ADHD as living with that as problems. So this is the ADHD child really quickly right here. This is the children with ADHD. Then we're going to hop over to their siblings. So forgive me. So the children with ADHD basically understood their life as problems. That was the sole way they understood themselves. They had problems with learning. You can kind of read the list here. These were taken from the words of the children themselves. Hyper was their word. Bad. Trouble. Weird. Think about that self-talk. Pills. That was a theme. That's what their life meant. Pills. Mom, right? Mom. Mom was central for most of these children because mom was doing most of the daily management in the families at this time. Lots of that is shifting in my own research with fathers. That's changing sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly. But mom was an actual theme. And then in children the African American children and Hispanic children in this study were very clear that they experienced racism as part of their experience of ADHD. Because people would, to them, explain their behaviors as, well, it's because you're a black boy, that's why you behave this way, right? Or you're from El Salvador, and so you're just out of control. So there was this very frightening attachment between race or ethnicity and their ADHD identity. So it was they didn't have a lot of positive things to say about themselves. Now, mind you, this study was done in the late 90s and publications came out in the early 2000s. Siblings, we moved over to the siblings. We did these in-depth interviews with them as well. 104 interviews, that's a lot. 104 interviews, and we had 29 diaries. So we did direct interviewing. We also had them write for us about everyday life. These pieces kind of boiled down to that same idea of disruption that we had heard in the other studies. For them, it broke down into 4 kind of major categories. They were very frequently victims of their siblings' impulsivity, hyperactivity, etc. They were often in positions of caretaking, which was really burdensome to them, even if they were a younger sibling, because they were viewed often as more responsible or in control of themselves. They had these particular pieces. They were experiencing a lot of grief. They just really, really wanted a, quote, normal family. That was really hard to hear that. They wanted peace and quiet. They felt there was an expectation of invisibility, meaning if you weren't the one causing disruption, the expectation was you would not cause any other disruption. That's a lot to put on a growing child because, as you all know, adolescence in and of itself is just disruption. I think that's adolescence disruption. I think that's the definition. It's my experience, right? Because their entire bodies are disrupted, their social worlds are disrupted. They are, and correctly so, tasked with disrupting their dependence on their parents. I mean, the task of adolescence is to claim independence. That's a task of disruption. And so, so for them to just have their own developmental path be one of feeling expected to not be disruptive was really at odds for them. And their strategies to deal with it were pretty, I think, predictable. Retaliation worked a bit early on, but they learned that that probably just got things into more trouble. Therefore, they would move into an accommodative style. That's middle child syndrome. My own middle boy, Noah. I've been so conscious about not creating middle child syndrome for him, and I think he was born into it. He just, okay, no, I'm fine. You're good. I'll take care of that. Oh yeah, I'll put dinner in. No worries. He's just very accommodating. Wants to try to, I hope not try to be invisible, but that may be how he copes with it. And then, of course, avoidance. And that was, again, that's the scary part for me, is that avoidance piece is one of those steps of, not financially, emotionally divesting from the family and kind of a risk factor for that chaotic style. We don't want that to happen. So that was another hard study for us. But there's good news in there. This is a little bit of an older picture. It is, I think that's probably about 6 years old now. Wow. Time's flying, folks. Okay. What I'd like to do, because that big key idea of understanding the biology of ADHD was so important in families as they would cope over time, I want to give you a chance to understand ADHD and the body in a different way, perhaps, than you've heard that before. So we're going to kind of move over to this a little bit. This was a really fascinating study done by Shaw, and Shaw's interest was looking at the brain with ADHD and asking the question, is there something different about the brain with ADHD? I mean, we can see that we have pieces of evidence in terms of learning and behavior, and lots of psychoeducational testing. You know, if your kiddos have been to school and maybe the school has done a whisk and they've done some of these kind of standardized tests to find out where your kid is in terms of different learning pieces and intelligence and processing speed and working memory. Those are things that probably are familiar to many of you. So we have lots of really good data there about ADHD and those pieces, but that's a little different than actually being able to look at the human brain and ask, is there a difference in the brain? And so that's kind of what Shaw did. He said, well, let's take kids who seem to be typically developing, no unusual behaviors or learning challenges, etc., and let's take brain scans of them over several years. And then let's enroll kids who have ADHD. We'll age match them, so we have the same ages of kids, and we'll take pictures of those same kids over many years, right? So rather than, from a science perspective, this is the kind of data that's really intriguing, because you could take and do all of the scans at one time. You could get kids who joined the study and they were 4, and kids who were 2 and 4 and 6 and 8 and whatever, and sort of divide up these age groups and just take scans of all their brains, you know, and then start comparing them across. That would be interesting. But it wouldn't capture the changes in development of specific children. So you would always have this question scientifically, well, if there was a difference, was it really a difference, or was it just a difference in the kids? You know, because random nature of selection and those kinds of pieces doesn't really account for that. So that's what Shaw did, was said, let's eliminate that. Let's take pictures of the same kids, age match them, and then we'll watch them over time. And we'll create a model. So they took all the brain scans mathematically and created a way of looking at them and comparing them. And this is kind of a fun slide. I really enjoy this one. Sometimes it's hard to see that in the upper brain scan models, they're kind of a bluish color, and in the lower set, they're sort of a purple color. It shows up a little bit better in print than it does on video. But the blue colored brain scans are children with ADHD, and the purple are typically developing children who don't have those symptoms or challenges. And this is specifically data from ages 7 to 12. And what they looked at was they measured how thick that cortex of the brain really kind of is. What's happening with those cells as they're maturing. Basically, it's where is the brain growing up and how is that going? And what you can see is if you look at the back of the brain in the very first 7-year-old slides, the very back of the brain on that top set is that there's all kinds of activity here, there's all kinds of thickening, there's all kinds of connections happening, and then there's this sort of slow progression forward to 12 where the front part of the brain really starts kind of maturing. And what's really interesting is that the pattern is exactly the same. It's the same pattern. It's maturing at the back, right, and moving forward. But what is not the same is the rate. So if you were to look at a child with ADHD at 10 years old and try to match that with a typically developing brain scan on the lower set, which do you think would probably be the best match? Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. 8, it's actually, I think, probably 7 is in terms of just looking at the overall structure and development piece. So it's about a 30% difference. So at age 10, the brain literally looks like a 7-year-old brain, at least in terms of averages. Now, mind you, these are averages, right? It does vary a little bit more than that. Here's what's interesting about all those years we've been taking data from schools and psychological assessment is that on average, those skills of executive functioning, we'll call them, right, those front brain skills, they tend to be about 30% difference as well. So this was the first time we really could look at the brain and see how there was a difference in how it was growing and maturing. Interestingly enough, the earlier data sets showed that children with ADHD had advanced growth in one area of their brain very early on. Any guesses what that might be at 2? Pardon?
Empathy?
Not apathy. Gross motor skills, I heard someone say. Yes, several people, right? So what does this mean? That meant that at 2, the child with ADHD had so much activation of gross motor skills, maybe even less self-control even at 2. So more access to the world, less judgment already. This is why your child at 2 is, you walk into the kitchen and they're on the top of the refrigerator. And you're thinking, wait a minute, you kind of walked late, but how is this happening? I mean, you skipped walking altogether and went to running. That was kind of eye-opening. So one area of rapid maturity was that motor cortex early on, gross motor. So a couple of things about this study that raised some questions. At 12, these brains basically matched up. So what does that mean? Does that mean at 12, ADHD disappears and it doesn't exist anymore? That wouldn't be what our experiences tell us. That has not been the case in either or any of my 3, so nor the hundreds of kids I have worked with over the years. So what this study did, at least from my interpretation, is it opened a window for us to question the idea of what we call a developmental critical period. Is there a window of time that the brain needs to sort of achieve these pieces for them to be as functional in that task as possible? We know that critical windows are a real thing because of language development. I don't know, many of you may remember kind of hearing about this case in the news. I think it was about the late 80s, early 90s. But it was a very prominent case in the news for quite some time because a child who was about 12 to 14 years old was discovered having been basically locked up in a room her entire life with neglect, barely fed, not nurtured. It was this horrible, horrible situation of neglect and abuse. No stimulus, literally just left alone for all of these years. And so the child, in fact, had no language skills at all. Didn't speak any words, could make sound. There wasn't a physiological problem making sound, or there was not a problem with hearing. So they ruled those pieces out. And the child was taken, of course, into custody. And a lot of work was done with speech therapy and special education and OT, etc. Just a tremendous amount. It was such a shocking case that it caused quite an outpour of support. And what we learned from that case was that, in fact, language has a critical window period. And if we don't develop language, symbolic language in its use early on, then that kind of skill cannot develop. So very important, that we engage in language, regardless of speech, hearing, culture, multiple languages in a home, whatever it is, that children have a critical window to accept and develop the brain to do that. And so I've been wondering for some time since the Shaw study was published, I wonder if, in terms of this executive functioning that we often talk about, if that isn't true as well. Now, we know that kids with ADHD, they do develop, right? They don't stay exactly the same forever. And that 30% on average, that kind of diminishes a bit over time in terms of the impact in life. But verbal impulsiveness, hyperactivity changes but is still present. And hyperactivity at 8 is jumping all over the furniture and running all over the house, and you've gone for 15 minutes to borrow a lawnmower from your neighbor, and you come back and there's eye holes in the wall and a tent has been strung up, and whoa, what happened with all of this hyperactivity and impulsivity here? At 30 years old, the adult with ADHD might not be doing those things. They might be vacuuming at 2 in the morning because they're so restless and they're not sure why, and something's got to get done, so I'm going to do it. The features of ADHD do change over the lifespan, but 80% of children will keep their symptoms into adulthood at some level. That's a really big thing. So again, I'm kind of wondering if there's not a critical period. So, why is that happening? What do we know about that? This speaks to the idea of the origins of ADHD. And not surprising that what we really seem to know now is that this is really part of the human story. This is a part of our genetic code. It is not as simple as doing a blood test from 2 parents and then coming up with a probability. Do you remember doing that in high school, biology? A Punnett square, they called that, right? You could, the big X, little x kind of thing, and what's the percentage of chance that the bean sprout you just grew is going to be yellow versus green or whatever, This is much more complicated genetics than that. However, there are very consistent findings in very, very large samples, very, very large studies that, even though there are about a dozen genes that seem related very heavily to ADHD, there are 4 that come up over and over and over and over again, and each of them seem to have kind of a very similar function. When those genes are present, they change how one particular brain chemical is used. It's dopamine. So there's your $10 word for today, right? Dopamine. Take that to a pub quiz later. Dopamine, and it's not just dopamine that is the issue, but these particular genes tell the brain where this dopamine issue is happening, and all of them code for our prefrontal cortex. So we go back to this slide here. They're all coding for that front part of our brain. So that's pretty interesting as well. Each of these genes works a little bit differently, and I'm struggling to not run up to the slide and kind of point things out. But, the thing about brain cells is they communicate with chemical transmission, right? We can't, if all of our brain cells actually touched each other and used like AC/DC current type stuff, imagine the heat, right? Our brains couldn't do that. It doesn't work that way. So we use chemical messaging to send signals. Dopamine in this case is the little black dot. That's the transporter we're talking about, the message sender. And when each of these genes is present, it sort of changes that process. It may be that the cells that are receiving dopamine, kind of like a key in a lock, the locks aren't quite fitting, or there might not be enough of them to pick up the signal very well. It may be that the cell producing the dopamine doesn't quite produce enough to really trigger easily those 2 cells to talk to one another. A couple of different genes have that issue. And then there's one specifically that has to do with recycling dopamine, right? Because we can't, if we had to rely on producing new dopamine every time we had a thought or controlled our body in some ways, we really wouldn't be able to make that happen. We have to have such rapid turnaround that the brain is always releasing dopamine, recycling dopamine, releasing it and recycling it. And in one of these particular genes, it sort of alters the recycle phase such that as soon as the dopamine's released, it's like automatically recycled. It doesn't really have the time to move across and send a signal. So that's a big issue. And then there's another gene that kind of seems to get in the way of helping us produce dopamine effectively, because this brain chemical is basically kind of one recipe step away from something called norepinephrine. There's another $10 word. Norepinephrine and dopamine are very, very similar, and if we need dopamine, we can convert the norepinephrine. But there's a gene that seems to be in play that kind of changes that process, and it makes that not happen so well. And so then we end up with basically the same effect. Different genes, but not enough dopamine really there to do its job in a way that allows those cells to communicate. And it's happening right here in the frontal lobe. So something for us to look at then is, wow, what is the frontal lobe supposed to really do for us? That might be a completely different way to think about ADHD, because what we've thought about all these years is, we've even created this name of ADHD all based on our observations of symptoms, right? So it is impulsivity and hyperactivity and inattention. That's all of that language from the psychiatric Bible, right? That big book that they open up to figure out, how those observations and measurements map to some sort of language like a diagnosis. And those are great words. They definitely describe what we see. The challenge is that even clinicians, we're not really very satisfied with that language, right? Because every time I've ever interfaced with a family, ever, clinically, they say to me, well, I'm puzzled because, they say he has ADHD or she has ADHD, and yeah, I know she can be inattentive, but she also can play video games for 12 hours and forget to go to the bathroom. And you're like, yeah, that's highly focused attention. So people often struggle with a diagnosis because there are these weird things that don't quite make sense. So I think if we move to a different way of considering ADHD, some of those things make more sense to folks. Before we jump into that, here's the fun thing about ADHD is it comes with friends. They are not always the friends you want hanging around your living room. They are the friends who drive their motorcycle into the living room and park it there to chat, like Fonzie, right? Boy, I'm dating myself now. But absolutely, the thing about ADHD living in our prefrontal cortex, our frontal lobe, is that our frontal lobe does a lot of things for us. And it is deeply interconnected with almost all the rest of our brain. So it's not surprising that we also see rates of these kinds of, you might hear the older term comorbid, or more presently we say co-occurring conditions, but these things are also going on for our kiddos with ADHD. The things that concern me, they all are concerning because they offer challenges to us. The behavior pieces, of course, being often the more vexing for families, but the anxiety and depression pieces also, those are the ones that tend to get us right in our heart. Right, so this is me planting a seed, why I want to talk about mind, body, heart connections and families. I think back to my oldest boy at 6 or 7 years old, absolutely refusing to go to some family event that none of us wanted to go to. It was a church thing or something, and dressing up, and on a hot summer day, who wants to do any of that, right? You want to go out and play and wear shorts and barbecue. And, this was before I really had launched into my career doing what I do now. So I was still really much in the novice and learning phase, and I was exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted. And I just lost it. Sent the rest of the family, sat him down. We're not going, very disappointed. I'm very angry about this. I don't know what to do. I'm tired of going through this over and over and over and over again. And of course, because, I was an inexperienced parent in many ways, and I hadn't developed all of the skills I have now, I said the thing you shouldn't say, which is, I must just be a really bad dad. Because you feel that way. You do, don't you? You feel very much like it is all on your shoulders. And he immediately responded with, well, I must just be a really bad kid. And that's where I had to take a deep breath and say, no. In fact, you are not. This anger is my problem. It is not your problem. And it really created a space for me to say, whoa, something has to happen. I need to get better at this. I need to understand this. And that was pretty much the time where I left my career as a restaurateur of 10 years at that point, and I became a specialist in this because I could not allow that to be the conversation with my children, ever, 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 ever. And these pieces that come along with ADHD oftentimes these are the pieces that need more of our attention. Then, I've heard parents for years say, I can deal with the hyperactivity most of the time. I can't deal with the fact that my kid doesn't have any friends and hates himself for it and says those very words. I'm lonely. I hate that my friends don't like me, or whatever. It's very strong and negative and hurtful language. So we want to do better with all of this. And this is why you're here. I commend all of you, whether you're here, you're watching online, etc. I am just so pleased that you are here. That says to me, you want the kinds of outcomes we want to. We're going to be gearing up here pretty shortly to take a break because there's a lot of information I'm throwing at you. And it'll be good to have 10 minutes to just kind of wander and just kind of reset before we come back. But I really want to get to this piece of, well, if impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention aren't the best ways to understand ADHD, what is? Is there something more? And this work by Russell Barkley, some of you may have his books. He's pretty famous in the ADHD world. He's been a 36-year intensive researcher in ADHD as a psychologist. He has multiple doctorates. He's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. I felt really lucky. We had 3 days to work with him a few years ago because he actually, his early postgraduate residence was up at the Child Development and Rehabilitation Center with us in Portland. A lot of people don't realize that. So we brought him back as a distinguished alumni, and he was flattered and cut his fee, thank goodness, so we could afford him. But we got to spend 3 days with him as clinicians, and his knowledge base is so sound. He really understands ADHD in ways that I had never thought of it before. At the same time, he's kind of a glass half empty kind of a guy. And that's not me. So we didn't always jive on our interpretations of things. But very, very brilliant person, and middle of the 2000s brought forward a very new way of thinking about ADHD. And basically he said, look, we've got all of this emerging science about brain chemistry and brain imaging and genetics, and we have a long history of psychoeducational testing and behavioral testing and observational data collection. It's like, we know all of this about ADHD. We know that this lives in the prefrontal cortex. We know that there's a dopamine issue. Maybe we should ask the different question, which is, what does the frontal lobe really do for us? And maybe we can understand not only ADHD, but just the nature of self-control itself. What is self-control in a human being? And so there, he proposed looking at a tremendous amount of history. I mean, going back over 100 years, for example, and looking at early speech development research, etc. These 5 big domains of executive functioning. One of them being the perception of time. That's interesting. We'll get to that. The inhibition of responses to stimuli in the environment, filtering things out, not responding to them. Our working memory, and I should add working memory processing speed, are deeply connected with our prefrontal cortex. The task of internalizing our speech. Again, I'm going to get to that, but it's very interesting. And then sort of cumulatively, emotional and physical self-regulation. You sort of add a lot of these pieces up and then plug our front brain into our emotional brain, and what's that connection going to be like? We have to kind of regulate that. So those pieces come together. And there's plenty of slides there for you to look at, but perception of time becomes a pretty significant one. So what we know is that if the prefrontal cortex, our frontal lobe, is challenged, that our perception of time cannot be fixed in the same way that it is for most of us. 3 minutes, 3 hours can be interchangeable, because there is no internal cueing or feeling of that time passing. So you're in line at the bank, right? You are you don't even have to look at your watch, right, to know you've been in line for 10 minutes. You're like, come on, I've got to get back from lunch. I've only got about 15 minutes left. Oh, yep, 15 minutes left. I've been here for 10 minutes. We internalize that. your boss or a coworker says, wow, I really need to have you complete this report and I need it by the 20th and that's in 10 days. Is that going to be possible? And you immediately perceive what 10 days is. You feel what that is. You know if you can make that deadline or not, right? Because of time lives within us. And that's something that we're not born with. It develops in our brain, right? The 4-year-old is like, are we at grandma's yet? And you're like, 5 more minutes. When is 5 more minutes? 2 seconds later. Well, are we there yet? When are we going to get there? We've had those conversations for years. We're not born with that, but it develops over time. And it also develops in concert with understanding our social definition of time. So we match it up with the clock, and then we internalize all of that. And that is disrupted. It is a function of our prefrontal cortex. So if that wasn't happening, what would you expect to see? One of the reasons that you can play a video game for 10 hours and not go to the bathroom is you don't perceive the time passing in the same way, right? Or you're lost and wondering when you're going to get there, and you're 14 and you're still asking, are we there yet? And you're driving your parents crazy because you don't seem to understand that, well, look, we have a 2-hour drive. Oh, but it's already been 2 hours. And you're like, we've been in the car for 15 minutes. It's not been 2 hours. Or in everyday life, there's a book report due in 2 weeks, right? They got the assignment. They heard the assignment. They maybe even wrote down 2 weeks book report. There is not necessarily an anchor in time. What does that mean? Very eye-opening, isn't it? I put a little picture of this little antelope from Africa up there because I just love that idea that our prefrontal cortex, our frontal lobe, works as kind of this stimulus filter, right? Because we all have, even as human beings, we all have fight or flight response. That is a real thing. It isn't something we made up. It's not something we can get rid of. But this part of our brain allows us, even if it's a fraction of a second, it allows us a filter to either say, put it in the background, it's not a threat, or I wonder what that is, maybe I should pay attention to that. It gives us sort of a gap, a choice, a moment where we can decide where are we going to go with this. Again, if this is disrupted, what I would expect to see is somebody who responds to every stimulus in the environment, every sight, every sound, every smell, because the filter piece just isn't quite working in the same way. It means also that there is incredibly high internet speeds of data coming into their brain in a way that does not to mine. I want to point out this is a superpower. Really is a superpower. I remember, again, my oldest son taught me so much in my early career learning to understand ADHD. We were driving on 26 up near the exit for the zoo. And I'm driving the car, kids are in the back. And he says to me, because at this point I'm working in the ADHD world, hey, Dad, do you know what the ADHD or the HD in ADHD stands for? And I'm really excited about this. I'm like, no, tell me more, right? He said, it stands for high definition, like HD TV. And I was like, okay, not only am I a nurse at this point, right, so I want to know more about what he's thinking and feeling and experiencing, but I'm a researcher, I'm a new researcher, I'm trying to get more data. So tell me a little more about that. Like, what does that mean? He said, well, we're driving down the road and you probably just see a big blur of green and brown, thinking about the forest. And I said, well, yeah, that's true, because one, I'm driving a car, so I've got my attention focused on what's ahead of us. But yeah, I think that's fair. I see the blur of green and brown. I don't really think about it much. My brain translates that into the symbol of forest. I know I'm driving through the forest. He said to me, well, when I look out the window, I see every individual tree all at the same time. And it actually kind of blew my mind. I don't know that I can even comprehend what that means. It definitely explained why you could walk into a little junk shop and 2 seconds later would say, oh, look at that really cool little red bird. And you're looking around going, what are you talking about? And he's seen some little granny knickknack on the shelf, 3 inches of dust on it, way at the back, somewhere. Who could ever have observed that? He can, because he has that superpower. That's a pretty big thing. I would back up and also plant a seed that even that timelessness piece, that blindness to time as Berkeley calls it, that is also a superpower because it can free us from the constraints and the prison of time as we know it. That's a pretty amazing gift in our society to be free from that. So here's what I would like to do. Stimulate your brain a little bit with these first two. I would like for us to take a 10-minute break so that we can kind of refresh just a little bit. We're going to come back, and very soon we're also going to hear from a good, wonderful colleague of mine, Bridget O'Boyle Jordan, who is going to talk about medication today because people have so many questions about that, and unapologetically, we just like to put up all the pros and cons so that you have a good vocabulary. We're going to continue the discussion here with looking at this biological understanding of ADHD, and then we'll have some time with Bridget, and then we're going to take a break for about a half an hour from 11:30 to 12. So our guests online can kind of plan for that. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about all this sort of mind, body, spirit intervention for children and families. So it should be a really good, productive morning. We are going to make time for question and answer session at the end. Our colleagues from Swindells are going to be passing out some cards during the 30-minute break. They're going to collect questions, kind of put them into a format that will work for a good question and answer to also be useful online as well as here. And then we will go from there. So I will say really quickly, just given the nature of presenting for such a long time today, during our breaks, I'm not going to really be able to answer questions. I just need to rehydrate, catch my breath for a little bit, and then we'll come back. But we'll save your questions for that half hour at the end, and I'll do my best to answer them there. So let's take a little break. Thank you.